coming up on Judge Rinder's Crime Stories.
We know that organised crime groups move huge shipments of cocaine across the Atlantic in multi-ton loads. We had an inkling that there might be a shipment about to arrive in UK waters.
There's always a danger in entering an unknown space to meet unknown people. We just don't know what's going to be waiting for us. It was the third largest seizure in history. It doesn't happen every day. It was a shock even to us to find that quantity of cocaine on board.
And later,
it was genuinely my worst fear in the world. It just didn't feel real.
According to eyewitnesses, he'd been travelling well in excess of the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, driving on the wrong side of the road before he clipped a curb and lost control.
every year, Border Force officers operating in UK waters seize Class A drugs worth hundreds of millions of pounds. Working with law enforcement partners like the National Crime Agency, they are determined to prevent drug trafficking and to bring those responsible to justice. Drug smugglers and organized criminals continue to find ways to evade capture, and so staying one step ahead can be a huge challenge for the authorities. This is the case of MV Bianca. As an island nation, we're fortunate to have a stunning coastline. This beauty, though, comes at a cost. Stretching over 11,000 miles, it can leave us vulnerable to criminals. It's a job of the National Crime Agency to stop gangs attempting to bring shipments of illegal drugs via the sea before they reach our shores.
My name's Mark Blackwell. I'm a senior manager with the National Crime Agency, and I manage the NCA's Maritime Aviation and Military Intervention Cell. We know that organised crime groups move huge shipments of cocaine across the Atlantic in multi-ton loads. Our job is to identify those and to interdict on them, often far out to sea before they get to the UK.
The Atlantic Ocean may be a huge open space, but every vessel, boat or cargo ship coming towards British waters is monitored by the authorities, so it's not easy for criminals to get across without being detected.
So very often, crime groups will move shipments of drugs across the Atlantic using what's called a mother vessel. And then what happens is that ship gets closer to the UK or to its destination, the drugs are offloaded to what we call a daughter.
In August 2016, the NCA were tipped off that a cargo of drugs might be smuggled across the Atlantic soon.
We were looking for the mother vessel in this case. We had an inkling that there might be a shipment about to arrive in UK waters, but we didn't know where and we didn't know when. So it was like looking for a needle in a whole field of haystacks.
All that Mark and his teams across the coast could do was keep alert and hope that they could stop the potential shipment before it reached Britain. They would need a stroke of luck.
The Bianca was identified by a sharp-eyed watchkeeper at the National Maritime Information Centre near Portsmouth, who noticed a vessel that had come 600-odd miles from its home port in Ramsgate out into just south of Ireland, and then immediately turned round and made its way back to the UK. You'd expect to see a fishing boat go out to sea and perhaps spend some time there catching its load, but in this case, it stayed a little while, and it kind of fitted the profile that we might expect for a daughter vessel to be picking up from a mothership.
It was time to call in the support of Border Force. Border Force is a part of the Home Office and is responsible for frontline border control operations at UK sea and airports.
My name is Nick Bonner. I'm the commander of the Border Force cutter, the Vigilant. It's a 42-metre-long ship. We've got a crew of 12 people.
The cutter HMC Seeker was also close by. First officer on board was Andrew Viddermore.
Bianca was transmitting a signal known as an automatic identification system, which we were able to track via our National Maritime Information Centre to follow the movement of a vessel before it arrives to the UK. Bianca's a commercial vessel, so there needs to be a commercial purpose behind the voyage. There's costs to cover in terms of crew and fuel and insurance for a vessel. So what we needed to determine was what the purpose of the voyage out into the Celtic Sea was, to return immediately. The suspicion is that she wasn't there very long. Whatever she went out there for was potentially to collect something to return. The Bianca was a former fishing vessel, so she's built to handle large cargoes, but she had the capability to bring anything back into the UK.
The behaviour of the boat stood out. But was that alone enough to reassure the team that this was a vessel carrying the drugs?
This was an instinctive decision. Sometimes you have to go with your best judgment. But in reality, we could have been chasing the wrong vessel for hundreds of miles while the real daughter vessel got away.
They kept a safe distance, but continued to monitor MV Bianca. They needed to see where the vessel was headed. Was it coming to Britain?
So we looked at the projected route of the vessel coming back to the UK, and it actually took it very close to the Scilly Isles. And that was a key moment for us because we didn't know where the drugs were destined for exactly. There was a chance that it could have offloaded in the Scilly Isles itself. So we had to take a gamble as best we could to let it run through there and intercept it the following day.
Boarding a vessel out at sea is a huge risk and a danger for all those involved.
Maritime interception is an extremely hazardous operation. It's not one you enter into lightly. There's all sorts of factors that can intervene, such as the weather, such as the sea state, such as equipment failure. And also we're extremely wary about what the crew of the target vessel are going to do.
The most dangerous aspect of our job is boarding from one vessel to another. It's not unusual for drug traffickers to jettison the load if they believe they're going to be intercepted, or to try and outrun the intercepting vessel, or even in extreme cases to set the vessel alight and abandon it.
Despite the risk, the NCA and Border Force teams believed that they had a strong target in the MV Bianca, but they still had no idea how many men were on board, or whether they were armed and dangerous.
I was serving as first officer on board HMC Seeker, so it was my responsibility to put a boarding team together from between the two vessels. We fortunately had officers from Border Force and the National Crime Agency embarked on both vessels.
The attack would be put in by two cutters, and they deploy their rigid hulled inflatable boats, their ribs, to deliver the boarding party onto the Bianca.
There's always a danger in entering an unknown space to meet unknown people. We just don't know what's going to be waiting for us at the end of that.
There was a significant event just prior to the boarding when the vessel was hailed by another ship, and the Bianca radioed back that she was bound for Ramsgate. That told us that the ultimate destination of the drugs was the UK.
As a fishing vessel, Bianca was a high-sided vessel. The practicalities of boarding from our boarding boat mean we essentially have to come alongside and climb out of one vessel onto the side of another, climb over the rails.
We know exactly what we're doing, we know exactly where to go and how we're going to do it. It's a tense moment until you get the all clear.
One of the first things we need to do is make that vessel safe. So we'll identify any crew members that may be around, and we'll also go to the wheelhouse to secure the vessel.
The first priority would be to establish who was on board the vessel and to contain it, because effectively it's a crime scene.
We found a man in the wheelhouse who identified himself as the skipper of the vessel. He did appear to be nervous, but that's often the case when we appear out of the blue. The man we found in the wheelhouse identified himself as Mr. McDermott. He was the skipper of the vessel. I asked him how many crew members he had on board. He told me there were 3 in total.
So while the commander of the enforcement team is talking to the driver, the rest of the enforcement team would quickly skirmish around a small boat like that to make sure that there's not lots of people hidden. The immediate priority is the people that are on board, because if there is a consignment of drugs, they're not going to do you any damage.
One of the first tasks for me as boarding leader when I get on board is to take a position from the vessel's navigation system to ensure that the skipper knows that he's inside UK territorial waters. That's important to us because the area we patrol is up to 12 miles from the UK coastline. Anything crossing that 12-mile border, carrying any prohibited or restricted items, such as drugs, is deemed to have imported those goods to the UK. So I need to understand at that stage that Mr. McDermott knows that he has imported those goods. Once he'd agreed that he knew he was inside the 12-mile limit, I asked Mr. McDermott if he had any prohibited or restricted items on board the boat, and he said yes. I said, do you believe that to be cocaine? And he said, I'm certain it is.
The first message that we got back was that the skipper of the vessel had said there was some cocaine on board. This was an interesting admission and it was unusual.
When I asked him about the reason for his voyage, his demeanour visibly changed. He became withdrawn and he said to me, did you receive the call that we made to customs? So I asked him what the call was about. He said he'd made a call to customs to tell them he was being forced to pick up a load. I asked him what the load was and he said, I presume it's cocaine. At that point, I arrested Mr. McDermott on suspicion of the importation of a controlled drug and cautioned him not to say anything that would harm his defence later in court.
He was known to the leading officer from my team that boarded the vessel as somebody he'd dealt with before. And once we'd heard that name, we were fairly confident that we'd got the right vessel.
McDermott had a previous conviction for drug trafficking, where he had admitted to being paid to sail a boat from Spain containing cannabis. It was enough to leave NCA and Border Force officers feeling confident that this was a vessel carrying the contraband.
When I questioned Mr. McDermott about his relationship to the other two crew members, he stated that he didn't know them at all and that they were the people forcing him to carry these drugs into the UK. The statement he made that he didn't know them later come back to be significant in court.
The two other crew members on board identified themselves as Gerald van der Kooi and David Pleasance.
Pleasance and van der Kooi were arrested soon after McDermott. Pleasance was trying to dispose of evidence by throwing the contents of his pockets overboard, so was arrested immediately, followed shortly thereafter by van der Kooi. David Pleasance had a considerable criminal record. He'd been known to the police for some years. We'd call him a career criminal. We knew less about the third member of the crew, the Dutchman. All we knew that he had a return airline ticket to fly back to the Netherlands a few days later.
With Michael McDermott and his two accomplices safely under arrest, it was down to Border Force and NCA teams to try to locate the drugs within the fishing vessel. The officers were confident they'd find the drugs on board, but even they were about to be shocked by the scale of what they would find below deck.
Coming up, the shocking cargo of drugs is finally uncovered.
It was a shock even to us to find that quantity of cocaine on board.
The street-level value alone was over £80 million.
On the 18th of August 2016, Border Force officers raided the fishing vessel MV Bianca after monitoring its suspicious behavior. Michael McDermott, the boat's skipper, surprised officers by admitting they were carrying cocaine, and he and his two crew were immediately arrested. With the men in custody, it was down to officers to search the vessel to try to find the drugs. What lay below the ship's deck would surprise them all.
En route sailing back to Falmouth, McDermott made an alarming revelation. Their boat had sustained major damage and was now sinking.
He told me that there was a leak in the engine room, which had been caused when the vessel came alongside another vessel at sea to take the drugs off. I asked one of my team to go into the engine room and investigate, and we found that the engine room was virtually completely underwater, with only the top portion of the engine itself showing. We called back to Vigilant and requested a diesel portable pump to be brought over, which the team set up on the aft deck and began to drain the water out. She was slowly sinking in the engine room, and when she lost power, if the engine stopped, she wouldn't have lasted very long in those sea conditions, so it was important to us to get that water out quickly to save the vessel.
So it was our job to get one of our salvage pumps from the cutter, my ship, to the Bianca. So the rib came back, and we collected the salvage pump and took it to the Bianca so we could just basically control the flow of water.
As soon as we saw the damage to the vessel, that was another good indication to us that we'd got the right boat. What we think almost certainly happened was that the Bianca was damaged when it went to transfer the drugs from the mother vessel at sea.
Pumps managed to control the water intake, and the boat could proceed to Falmouth, where the men could be taken into custody, and the boat could be thoroughly searched safely.
We were approximately 10 miles south of Falmouth at the time of boarding. It took us about 3 hours to run in there and get the vessel alongside. Over the course of the day, I spent approximately 8 hours with Mr. McDermott and had a good chance to judge his demeanour all the way through the day. It was interesting to see Mr. McDermott go from very calm and relaxed at the stage of boarding to visibly nervous and relieved once the arrest had been made, and he was completely compliant throughout all the way to custody.
Once we got to Falmouth, the crew of the Bianca were taken to a local custody centre, which means then we can concentrate properly on searching the boat. That involves forensics, scenes of crimes officers from the police, and a physical search.
It was below deck that the startling haul the gang had been transporting was revealed.
In the fish hold of the vessel, underneath some sacks of gravel and sand, were 38 bales of cocaine. With a combined weight of almost a tonne, some 939 kilos. It is inconceivable that an amount of drugs of that volume would have been on the vessel without all 3 crew members being aware. The street level value alone was over £80 million.
It was the 3rd largest seizure in history. It doesn't happen every day. It was a shock even to us to find that quantity of cocaine on board.
It's a massively significant seizure. Current estimates put the amount of cocaine imported into the UK at about 25 to 30 tonnes a year. So to take a tonne out, as we did in this seizure, can make a significant impact.
939 kilos of cocaine with a street value of £80 million. The cocaine was almost 70% pure. Criminals densely pack the drug when transporting it. The stronger, smaller it is, the more it can be diluted and cut, which means that it can go further and further. The higher the purity, the closer the drug is to its source. As a search on board continued, other evidence was identified.
So in order to transfer the drugs at sea, both vessels have got to know where to meet. It's a fairly obvious point. We actually found the coordinates for that location amongst the property of one of the other crew members, David Pleasance. We were able to match that with the navigation gear on board the vessel, and it showed what was almost certainly the rendezvous where the Bianca met with the mother vessel to pick the drugs up in the Atlantic.
And what about McDermott's suggestion that he didn't know the crew, that he'd been forced to transport the drugs and had made calls to warn customs of the imminent arrival?
Once the crew was charged, the investigation could begin in earnest. And one of the things the investigation team did was make inquiries about the vessel while she was still in Ramsgate. Michael McDermott claimed that he was acting under duress. Effectively, he was forced and coerced into being the skipper for carrying out his role. But in point of fact, what independent witnesses were able to tell us was that he seemed at ease on the vessel with the other 2 crew members and didn't seem to be under any pressure at all, which knocked a significant hole in his argument.
During the time it took us from arrest of Mr. McDermott to get him to a Border Force facility in Falmouth Docks, he'd had the time to consider the statements he'd made and their future relevance in court. He retracted several of the admissions he'd made, which included him changing the statement that he had phoned customs and amending that he'd made several unsuccessful attempts to phone customs. He also admitted that he had known one of the crew members for 3 weeks, rather than not knowing them at all at the point of arrest.
In Bristol Crown Court on the 16th of March 2017, both Pleasance and Van der Kooi admitted drug importation offences. But McDermott denied the charge, continuing with his claim that he had been acting under duress and was forced into shipping the drugs.
Mr. McDermott, at the point of arrest, made it very clear that he was fearful of the other members of the crew. He very much played his hand that he was the victim and that he wanted to be kept separate from the crew. He didn't wish to be transported with them, and he kept up that line all the way through.
McDermott told the court that he'd been pressured into doing the job, as he'd had threats to himself and his family by people connected to the drugs. The prosecution argued that if that was the case, he could have contacted the authorities at any number of stages, but he chose not to.
In the case of duress, the onus is on the Crown to prove Mr. McDermott's guilt rather than Mr. McDermott to prove his innocence. Fortunately, in this case, the National Crime Agency investigating team were able to submit a case that was so strong they proved beyond doubt that Mr. McDermott was not only a willing participant in the operation, but he was an integral member of the whole process.
As the trial progressed, further details emerged. McDermott had been instrumental in purchasing MV Bianca for cash and had made repairs to the vessel, accompanied for well over a fortnight by Pleasance. By the 13th of August, they had been joined by Van der Kooi, and the three men set sail out of the port of Ramsgate. They had met a tug out at sea, and 6 men had loaded drugs from their vessel to the Bianca. They set back to Britain, intending to sail to Middlesbrough, but the damage to the vessel wouldn't allow them, so they rerouted towards Falmouth. Michael McDermott was found guilty of conspiracy to evade a prohibition on importation. The 3 men appeared for sentencing. McDermott was given 16 years. The judge stated that he must have been close to those who organized his operation. He was trusted by those higher up the chain with a significant cargo. He had been dishonest in court and lied during the trial. On sentencing Pleasant to 14 years, the judge called him a career criminal and violent man, motivated by money, that was hired as a safe pair of hands to bring home the drugs. Despite the judge believing that Van der Kooi had played a lesser role, it was significant, and he was sentenced to 12 years. It was a great result all round for the NCA and the Border Force teams.
It's personally satisfying that we were able to seize almost 1 ton of cocaine and ultimately prosecute 3 crew members for a total of 42 years. It was also satisfying to see Mr. McDermott's plea of the unwilling victim be unpicked and unproven by the National Crime Agency in court to show that he was an active participant in the operation.
The boarding of the vessel was instinctive. We couldn't be certain we got the right boat at the time. So to bring it to a successful conclusion and to seize that quantity of drugs was immensely satisfying to the whole team. The smuggling of Class A drugs in the maritime arena presents a major threat to the UK. But operations like this one show that the NCA, working in tandem with partners like Border Force, can have an impact.
It shows to us the trend of ever-increasing amounts of cocaine being brought into the UK, and it was satisfying to be able to board the Bianca in testing conditions and take control and then complete the seizure.
Michael McDermott used his specialist skills as a sailor in order to attempt to evade border controls. He was a crucial link in a chain between cocaine manufacturers in South America and drug dealers in the UK. His conviction sends out a powerful message to organized criminals who attempt to use maritime means to bring drugs to our shores.
Coming up, a family left devastated by a driver who was out of control is left asking why the punishment doesn't fit the crime.
He got time off his sentence because he put his hands up and said, yes, I did it. Well, it's obvious you did it. Everything shows that you did it.
This is something that we've been given a life sentence for, that the rest of our lives we are going to have to deal with this every single day.
"157 people were convicted of causing death by dangerous driving in 2016 alone. And a further 32 were convicted of causing death by careless driving whilst under the influence of drink or drugs. The family of Bryony Hollands agreed for their case to be told in order to share how the actions of one reckless individual inflicted a loss from which they will never recover. This is the case of Bryony Hollins.
There's a bond between sisters that's incredibly special. And that was certainly the case between Bryony and Karen Hollins.
She was just over 2 years younger than me. We spent a lot of time together. My parents had brought her home when she was born, and I've given her a kiss on the head. And she's looking at me with a really shady look. And it's just the funniest picture ever. She's just kind of looking at me like, who is this big human giving me a kiss?
Myself, my wife Alison, and the two girls, Karen and Bryony. Very happy life together, nothing special, but, content with family and, just life generally.
Bryony's mum, Alison, finds it too upsetting to talk about her daughter on camera.
When we both went to secondary school, we were both in all of the orchestras at school.
Musically phenomenal. She had grade 8 French horn, grade 8 trumpet, grade 7 piano, and was described by a French horn teacher as the best French horn player that she'd ever taught.
Bryony wasn't just musically talented. Her personal qualities really shaped the lives of those around her.
She was always very aware of other people's emotions and how people were feeling. She was always looking to make people smile and kind of change the mood in the room.
In September 2014, Bryony moved to Sheffield to go to university and to pursue her love of studying music, whilst Karen travelled to America. It was a big shift for the sisters to be apart. Bryony's friend Caitlin helped support her in Karen's absence.
I became very, very close with Bryony. We spent a lot of time together, as much time as we possibly could. Bryony was obviously missing her sister, and I always wanted to be there for her in any way that I could.
They were reunited in the UK when Caitlin's mum married Bryony and Karen's uncle. They were now real family.
That day, in that green dress with her hair beautifully done, she just looked absolutely amazing, and the smile on Bryony's face the whole day. I think we're all very, very thankful that we got to enjoy that day together.
After the joy of the wedding, Bryony returned to university and was reunited with her boyfriend, Ben.
She was really excited about going up to see her boyfriend, Ben, who she'd met on the same music course in Sheffield, was going to meet his parents for the first time. I spoke to her on the phone on the Thursday evening because we were both going through Reading Station, and I just phoned on the off chance that maybe her train had been delayed and, I'd get off and we'd have a coffee before she went on up north. But she was already on her way. And then, of course, we heard nothing more.
I saw my mum sitting down, and she was very, very quiet. And I knew that something was wrong. She just said to me that Bryony had been hit by a car, but they couldn't save her. And in that moment, I fell to the floor.
Tragically, Bryony had lost her life.
It was genuinely my worst fear in the world, losing Bryony. And it just didn't feel real. At that point, we realised that we were going to have to tell my dad.
I went to work, the proud father of 2 beautiful daughters. Walked through the door. Karen was stood there looking absolutely ashen. Sit down, I've got some bad news. Your whole world turns upside down. Broken's not even the word. Broken suggests it's in pieces that can be put back together. I think crushed is a word that describes it.
The police advised the family that Bryony and Ben had been hit by a vehicle that had mounted the pavement whilst travelling at a high speed. The impact was fatal for Bryony, and Ben had been taken to hospital with serious injuries. The family rushed to be with her and to find out how this had happened.
Walking into that room and seeing the person that you love the most in the world, who was so full of life, completely robbed of her life, and just lying there lifeless in front of you it's the worst thing in the world. And I think that's always going to haunt me for the rest of my life.
How had this happened? Why would a car have been driven on the pavement? Information started to emerge about the driver of the vehicle, 26-year-old Thomas Burney.
According to eyewitnesses, he'd been travelling well in excess of the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, driving on the wrong side of the road before he clipped a curb and lost control.
But what was the explanation behind his erratic driving and ultimately fatal actions? When police arrived at the scene, Burney's blood alcohol was 3 times the legal limit, and he tested positive for cocaine. That cocktail of drink and drugs had proven to be lethal. With Bryony and Ben lying feet away from him, Burney's behavior in the aftermath of the crash was shocking.
We found out that he had tried to flee the scene and also kept saying, "No police, no police." And finding out those things is just, there's no remorse there at all. He didn't go over to see if they were okay. He didn't call the police. He didn't call an ambulance. He continued to think only about himself.
In complete contrast to Burney's behavior at the scene, an off-duty nurse had run to try to help.
She said, protocol just went out the window. She saw a young girl there dying before her, and, she just gave her CPR. She said she would always remember the way that the sunlight was catching Bryony's eyes, and she could tell how she was fighting. And then, by contrast, we were told Burney just was trying to get out of the car, was throwing drug paraphernalia into the hedge, trying to hide it, but witnesses saw and reported it to the police when they were on the scene.
Burney was immediately arrested and taken for questioning. Sean Joyce is a lawyer that specialises in criminal litigation. He has extensive experience of road traffic offences.
When he was arrested and taken to the police station, he was found to be around 3 times above the statutory drink-drive limit. Alcohol and drugs both have a similar effect on driving ability. They can both slow down reaction times, slow down thinking times. They can distort perceptions of distance and speed. When you have a combination of alcohol and drugs, then of course the effect of those combined substances will be enhanced.
People have said it's wrong place at the wrong time, and as a family, we've actually fought against using that phrase because they weren't doing anything wrong at all. They were a young couple on the pavement in a 30-mile-an-hour road, just out for a walk. The person who was in the wrong place at the wrong time was Thomas Burney.
Bryony's family needed answers. Why had Burney acted so callously at the scene? How could he have had such little thought for their daughter? He'd destroyed a life and devastated so many more. They needed to know that Thomas Burney would face the full force of the law for his actions.
Coming up, shocking evidence in court uncovers a cruel twist of fate.
I wanted the court to know, and I wanted the judge to know, but also I wanted him to know.
If you're going to drive a ton and a half of metal erratically, it can be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than a bullet.
21st of August 2015, Bryony Holland and her boyfriend Ben Evans, both music students at the University of Sheffield, were out walking. Thomas Burney was driving his Mercedes at excessive speeds, overtaking cars on blind bends, before he lost control, killing Bryony and seriously injuring Ben. He was under the influence of drugs and alcohol, but further shocking revelations were about to emerge that would leave question marks over whether Burney should even have been behind the wheel at the time of the accident.
Bryony's family had to come face to face with Thomas Burney in Nottingham Crown Court. He had little choice but to plead guilty.
One of the significant factors that any defence legal team and defendant have to consider is whether to plead not guilty and go through a trial process, or alternatively to plead guilty to the offences, avoid the need for a trial to take place, avoid the need for witnesses to give evidence. Then the courts under the Criminal Justice Act are obliged to reduce the punishment that they give to offenders by as much as 30%. Now, in a case like this, that's a significant inducement if you know you're guilty of an offence, because of the difference it will make to the length of any prison sentence.
I was one of the people to read a victim impact statement because I wanted the court to know and I wanted the judge to know, but also I wanted him to know a little bit of what I was feeling. He showed hardly any emotion. There were times that I felt like I couldn't look at him anymore.
But in my opinion, if you're getting into a car, which is a big vehicle, whether you mean to or not, there's still a possibility that that can be used as a weapon.
Thomas Burney's defence team revealed that he had lost his mother in 2007 when he was just 18, and that he'd become addicted to cocaine and to alcohol. Despite his family's attempts to support him, his problems had become too much for them. But it was a shocking revelation about Burney's health that compounded his decision to get behind the wheel. He knew that mixing alcohol and drugs were lethal for him and had caused him to black out and to have seizures. He had alerted the DVLA about the blackouts and seizures via a phone call. They had advised him not to drive for 12 months and had begun a medical review process.
The DVLA have a set of guidelines, medical guidelines, that have been drawn up by a panel of Home Office approved medical practitioners. So depending on what the medical condition is, then the DVLA will apply those guidelines and can suspend or revoke driving licenses for a fixed period of time, or in some cases indefinitely.
Tragically, whilst processing delays at the DVLA slowed down a decision being made, Burney killed Bryony. 6 weeks after the accident, the notification came through the DVLA, telling him that he was banned from driving. It was a cruel twist of fate for the family.
Knowing that there was the potential for him to have been banned from the road is even more devastating. It's unbelievable, really.
When you've got somebody that ignores the rules of the road and doesn't stick to them when you're talking about drinks, drugs, tyres, speeding, dangerous driving, he may very well have driven despite being banned. You know, we'll never know. But we only needed to change that timeline on that day by a few seconds, and instead he would have crashed behind or in front of Bryony and Ben.
The DVLA have now put processes in place to ensure that cases like this are looked at within a week. It was down to the judge to take all things into account and to determine Burney's sentence.
Judges are required to have regard to the sentencing guidelines which are issued by the Sentencing Guidelines Council. So offences are placed into a variety of categories depending on the seriousness. And when judging the seriousness of offences, judges will consider aggravating features. So in the case of Thomas Burney, it was the presence of drugs, presence of alcohol, and the very poor standard of driving.
when he was sentencing, he said, you know, Parliament sets down the maximum sentence, which is 14 years, and he had to come down a little from that for cases even more severe than this, which obviously for us as a family, you know, there couldn't be anything worse, but in reality, Ben could have been killed as well.
Bernie was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment. He will serve half. That's 4 years before being released on licence. He was banned from driving for 5 years. It was a bitter pill for the family to swallow.
I think 4 years is an absolute joke, and it's insulting to victims, to their families, because none of us are going to be okay in 4 years. This is something that we've been given a life sentence for, that the rest of our lives we are going to have to deal with this every single day. But for him, it's a matter of years.
It just overwhelms my body with frustration and anger and upset that the sentencing to me was so lenient. He got time off his sentence because he put his hands up and said, yes, I did it. Well, it's obvious you did it. Everything shows that you did it. So I don't understand that side of things and why that's okay.
The fact that I'm going to be tending Bryony's grave for however long I've got left on this planet, you know, and I'm capable of doing it. That could be 20, 30 years. You know, in less than 2 years' time, Thomas Burney will be out walking the streets. Keren's not going to have Bryony there as her chief bridesmaid. I don't know how I'm going to give a speech on that day, on what should be, you know, one of the proudest and happiest days of our life as a family, knowing that the second, well, perhaps behind the groom, the third most important person that should be there isn't going to be. You know, and I just don't know how we'll get through that day.
Since the trial, the family have focused their efforts into campaigning tirelessly for a change in the law and are calling for tougher sentencing.
On the face of it as it stands, there is a maximum sentence of 14 years for causing death by dangerous driving. But when you've got a whole legal framework and sentencing guidelines that give an automatic 1/3 discount for an early guilty plea, and then automatic release halfway through the remaining 2/3, effectively the most that you can actually lock somebody up for is 1/3 of the headline. I mean, if this was an advert, the Advertising Standards Authority would say it's misleading. You know, if he was inside for 10, 12 years, even as a father who's lost a precious daughter, I would accept that that's a long time. You know, even 7 or 8 years is a significant lifespan. If people look back and think what they've done over that period of time in their lives. But some of Bryony's flatmates, you know, their degree courses are only 4 years. And that's as long as he's in for. And, you know, already is halfway through that period.
Families of victims have campaigned for this for a long time, as have charities such as Break and others. There is currently a Ministry of Justice consultation which is considering that question, amongst others. So the proposal under consideration is whether the maximum sentence for causing death by dangerous driving should be increased from 14 years to life imprisonment, bringing it more in line with offences such as manslaughter and murder.
People need to know that there could be a serious, much longer sentence there, and that if you're going to drive a ton and a half of metal erratically, you know, it can be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than a bullet.
Bryony would have been 22 this year. In her memory, Keren is raising money for Break, the road safety charity.
I'm doing 12 half marathons in 12 months. I hope that Bryony will be proud of me as well for just pushing myself as much as possible and trying to help other people.
Despite everything they've been through, the family want Bryony's memory to live on and to make a difference for others.
Bryony was just a girl who just gave to so many people, you know, with a smile and a hug, was always generous with her time. You know, and those people are hurting and missing the smile that she always brought to a room.
I can't explain how much I'll miss her. Every single day. Every day I miss her.
There's no one for me that will ever be as special as she was to me. I just hope that she will always be remembered, and for every single life that she touched.
Drivers who kill or maim often receive very lenient sentences. The average prison sentence for a driver who has killed someone is 4 years. As a result of tireless campaigning from Bryony's families and others like them, change is looking imminent. In 2016, the government issued a consultation that could see the maximum penalty for offences of causing death by dangerous driving and causing death by careless driving under the influence of drink or drugs go from 14 years to life. The proposals are currently with Parliament. Let's see if they make the recommended and clearly necessary change.